A soldier's loyal companion remains at the gravesite for days. When the owner investigates, a discovery leaves everyone in tears. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The California sun beat down on the Memorial Garden Cemetery, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grass. Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance, her hand gripping the iron gate so tightly her knuckles turned white. It had been exactly 1 month since they'd buried her father, Staff Sergeant Mark Mitchell, and this was her first time returning to the grave. As she walked down the winding path, her steps faltered when she spotted a familiar shape in the distance. Buddy, her father's German shepherd, lay stretched out beside the granite headstone, his head resting on his paws. The dog's presence surprised her. They hadn't seen him since the funeral, assuming he'd wandered off to process his grief in whatever way dogs did. "Buddy," Sarah called out, her voice cracking. The dog's ears perked up, but he didn't move from his position. His eyes, usually bright and alert, carried a heaviness that matched Sarah's own grief. As she approached, she noticed the dirt matted in his fur and his slightly thinner frame. He'd clearly been here the entire time. Sarah's mother and younger brother arrived shortly after, having followed her to the cemetery. They found her sitting cross-legged beside the grave, watching Buddy, who remained unmoved by their presence. "Come on, boy," Sarah's mother, Linda, called gently, pulling a leash from her purse. "Time to come home." Buddy's response was immediate and heartbreaking. As Linda approached with the leash, he pressed himself closer to the headstone, a low whine escaping his throat. When she managed to clip the leash to his collar, Buddy began to resist, his nails scraping against the grass as he was pulled away. The moment Linda loosened her grip, he bolted back to the grave, circling it once before lying down in the exact same spot. They tried 3 more times, each attempt more futile than the last. Buddy wasn't just being stubborn. His devotion to Mark transcended basic obedience. The dog's determination to stay with his master, even after death, struck a chord deep within Sarah. "Let him stay," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "He needs this as much as we do." Sarah settled back down beside Buddy, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. The dog leaned into her touch, but didn't move from his watchful position. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Sarah found herself talking, first in whispers, then in a steady stream of memories that poured out like water from a broken dam. "Remember when Dad first brought you home, Buddy?" she began, her fingers still absently stroking his fur. He'd just returned from his second tour, and he said he needed a running partner. Mom thought he was crazy, bringing home a military working dog, but Dad knew exactly what he was doing. Buddy's ears twitched at the sound of Mark's name, and Sarah continued, each story drawing out subtle reactions from the loyal companion. She talked about the morning runs Mark and Buddy would take together, how they'd return covered in mud, but wearing matching expressions of joy. She remembered the nights when her father's PTSD would strike, and how Buddy would lay across his legs, grounding him until the memories passed. Linda and Tommy sat down too, forming a small circle around the grave. As the stories flowed, Buddy's posture gradually relaxed, though his eyes never left the headstone. The family found themselves sharing moments they'd nearly forgotten. The little details of life with Mark that made him not just a soldier, but a father, husband, and devoted friend to the dog who now refused to leave his side. The sun was setting by the time they prepared to leave. Sarah looked at Buddy, understanding filling her heart. "We'll bring you food and water," she promised him, "and we'll visit every day." As they walked back to their car, Sarah glanced over her shoulder one last time. Buddy had resumed his vigilant position, a silent guardian keeping watch over the man who had given him a home. Something about the dog's dedication nagged at the back of her mind, a feeling that there was more to understand about the bond between her father and his faithful companion. What Sarah didn't realize then was that Buddy's presence at the grave was more than just loyalty. It was the beginning of a mystery that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her father's death. A week after finding Buddy at the grave, Sarah returned to the cemetery carrying a cardboard box she'd discovered in their garage. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted, creating an ethereal atmosphere as she made her way down the familiar path. Buddy was there, as always, though now a water bowl and blanket marked his permanent residence. "Mom wants to understand why you won't leave," Sarah told the dog, setting down the box. "Maybe these will help us figure it out." She began removing items from the box, Mark's old belongings that she'd found scattered around Buddy's kennel. A worn tennis ball, a frayed tactical vest, and several dog toys showed signs of heavy use. But it was the collection of items around the grave that caught her attention. Things she hadn't noticed before. Hidden in the grass were Mark's dog tags, carefully placed at the base of the headstone. A weather combat boot lay partially buried near the corner. Most striking was a piece of paper, protected in a plastic sleeve, tucked behind a small rock. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for it. Linda arrived just as Sarah was unfolding the paper. "I thought I might find you here," she said, then noticed the items spread out before them. "What's all this?" "Buddy's been bringing things here," Sarah explained, her voice tight with emotion. "Dad's things. Look at how deliberately they're placed. This isn't random, Mom." The paper turned out to be a photograph, creased and worn at the edges. It showed Mark and Buddy in full tactical gear, standing before a military helicopter. What struck Sarah wasn't the image itself, but the inscription on the back, "Last day of training. Remember the protocol." And Linda sat down heavily on the grass, reaching for the photo. "I've never seen this before," she admitted. "Your father never talked much about his work with Buddy. Said some things were better left classified." Sarah picked up the tactical vest, examining it more closely. The patches had been removed, but the Velcro showed clear patterns where they'd been. One spot was different. A small pocket had been sewn into the lining, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. "Mom," Sarah said slowly, "I don't think Buddy was just Dad's running partner." She reached into the hidden pocket, her fingers brushing against something metal. Pulling it out, she found a small key with no identifying marks. Buddy, who had been watching them intently, suddenly sat up straighter. "I remember this day," Linda said, still studying the photograph. "It was 3 months before." Her voice trailed off. "Mark was different when he came back from that training. More vigilant. He started taking Buddy out at odd hours, and they'd come back exhausted." Sarah laid out the items in a row: the key, the vest, the photo, the dog tags. Each piece seemed to hint at a larger story, one that her father had kept carefully hidden. She noticed how Buddy's eyes tracked each item as she moved them, his attention particularly fixed on the key. "Dad always said Buddy was special," Sarah mused, remembering conversations from years ago. "He said some dogs are chosen for more than just companionship." Linda reached out to stroke Buddy's head, her expression thoughtful. "Your father was a complicated man, Sarah. There were parts of his life he kept separate from us. I always assumed it was to protect us." The emotions hit Sarah unexpectedly, not just grief for her father, but a growing awareness that she might not have known him as well as she thought. The Mark Mitchell who played catch in the backyard and helped with math homework seemed increasingly different from the man who had trained Buddy for some unknown purpose. As they sat there, surrounded by these pieces of Mark's hidden life, Sarah felt the first stirring of determination. These weren't just mementos, they were clues. Buddy wasn't just mourning, he was standing guard. The question was, over what? A gust of wind rustled the grass, carrying with it the distant sound of taps being played at a funeral in another part of the cemetery. Sarah watched as Buddy's ears perked up at the sound, his posture shifting subtly into something more alert, more purposeful. "Dad trusted you with something, didn't he, boy?" she whispered, studying the dog's intelligent eyes. "And you're making sure you keep that trust." The key felt heavy in her palm, its presence raising more questions than answers. Sarah closed her fingers around it, making a silent promise to both her father and his loyal companion. Whatever Mark had been protecting, whatever secret Buddy was guarding, she would help them see it through. What she didn't know then was that the key in her hand would unlock more than just a physical door. It would open a door to a past her father had carefully kept hidden, for reasons she was only beginning to understand. 2 weeks after discovering the key, Sarah found herself coordinating a memorial service for her father. The local Veterans Affairs office had reached out, suggesting a special ceremony to honor Mark's service and acknowledge Buddy's remarkable devotion, which had begun attracting attention from other cemetery visitors. Sarah stood in the cemetery's administrative office, reviewing the list of confirmed attendees. 5 members of Mark's former unit had agreed to come, including his commanding officer, Colonel James Reynolds. Their quick acceptance struck her as noteworthy, almost eager. "We'll need to set up chairs here." The cemetery director pointed to a map, but Sarah's attention was drawn to Buddy through the window. The dog had shifted his position, something he rarely did. He now sat rigidly alert, staring at a black SUV that had just pulled into the parking lot. 2 men in civilian clothes emerged, their military bearing unmistakable despite their casual attire. They walked directly to Mark's grave, and Sarah watched as Buddy's posture changed. His ears flattened, and though he didn't growl, his whole body radiated tension. "Excuse me," Sarah said, cutting off the director's planning. She hurried outside, arriving at the grave just as the men were leaving. Buddy's eyes tracked their movement, his body still rigid. "Can I help you?" she called out, but they were already climbing back into their vehicle. The SUV pulled away without acknowledgement, leaving Sarah with an uneasy feeling in her stomach. The day of the ceremony arrived under overcast skies. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle around Mark's grave, where Buddy maintained his vigil. People began arriving early. Veterans in pressed uniforms, local military families, and reporters drawn by the story of the dog who wouldn't leave his master. Colonel Reynolds arrived last, his presence commanding immediate attention. He moved with deliberate steps towards Sarah, his expression grave. "Your father," he said quietly, "was one of our finest. There's so much we could never tell you about his service." Before Sarah could respond, Buddy did something unexpected. He left his post by the grave and walked directly to Reynolds, positioning himself between the colonel and Sarah. The movement seemed protective rather than threatening. Reynolds' eyes narrowed slightly. "Remarkable animal," he said, studying Buddy. "Still following protocol, I see." Protocol? Sarah asked, but the ceremony was beginning, and Reynolds moved to take his seat. The service proceeded with military precision. Veterans shared stories of Mark's courage, his leadership, his dedication. But Sarah noticed they spoke in generalities, carefully avoiding specific missions or locations. When Colonel Reynolds took the podium, his words seemed chosen with particular care. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell understood sacrifice," Reynolds said, his eyes sweeping the crowd. He knew that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are the ones that can never be spoken of. He carried burdens so others wouldn't have to. As Reynolds spoke, Sarah noticed Buddy's behavior changing. The dog's attention shifted repeatedly between the colonel and different points in the cemetery, as if following an invisible pattern. She remembered the key in her pocket, the hidden pocket in the vest, the photograph's cryptic message about protocols. The ceremony reached its emotional peak as a bugler played taps. The mournful notes carried across the cemetery, and Sarah watched as several of her father's unit members exchanged subtle glances. Buddy remained perfectly still throughout the song, but his eyes never left Colonel Reynolds. After the ceremony, as people began to disperse, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation between 2 veterans. "Should have been handled differently. Mitchell knew the risks. Dog still guarding." They fell silent as they noticed her nearby. Sarah pretended to adjust the flowers by the grave, her mind racing. The veteran's words, Reynolds' careful speech, the mysterious men in the SUV. All of it suggested layers of complexity to her father's service that went far beyond his official record. Linda approached, carrying a folder of photos they'd planned to share. "The colonel wants to speak with us privately," she said, "about establishing a memorial fund in your father's name." But Sarah was watching Buddy, who had returned to his position by the grave. The dog's attention was fixed on a distant corner of the cemetery where the black SUV had reappeared. This time, no one emerged from the vehicle. It simply idled for several minutes before driving away. "Actually, Mom," Sarah said, feeling the weight of the key in her pocket, "I think we need to do something else first. I think it's time we found out what Buddy's really guarding." The growing darkness seemed to hold secrets of its own as the last mourners departed. Sarah remained by the grave, her father's hidden life feeling more present than ever. Whatever truth lay buried beneath the surface, she was now certain of one thing. The memorial service hadn't just been about remembering her father. It had stirred something into motion. And Buddy, ever vigilant, seemed to be waiting for what would happen next. 2 weeks after discovering the key, Sarah found herself coordinating a memorial service for her father. The local Veterans Affairs office had reached out, suggesting a special ceremony to honor Mark's service and acknowledge Buddy's remarkable devotion, which had begun attracting attention from other cemetery visitors. Sarah stood in the cemetery's administrative office, reviewing the list of confirmed attendees. 5 members of Mark's former unit had agreed to come, including his commanding officer, Colonel James Reynolds. Their quick acceptance struck her as noteworthy, almost eager. "We'll need to set up chairs here." The cemetery director pointed to a map, but Sarah's attention was drawn to Buddy through the window. The dog had shifted his position, something he rarely did. He now sat rigidly alert, staring at a black SUV that had just pulled into the parking lot. 2 men in civilian clothes emerged, their military bearing unmistakable despite their casual attire. They walked directly to Mark's grave, and Sarah watched as Buddy's posture changed. His ears flattened, and though he didn't growl, his whole body radiated tense. "Ion." "Excuse me," Sarah said, cutting off the director's planning. She hurried outside, arriving at the grave just as the men were leaving. Buddy's eyes tracked their movement, his body still rigid. "Can I help you?" she called out, but they were already climbing back into their vehicle. The SUV pulled away without acknowledgement, leaving Sarah with an uneasy feeling in her stomach. The day of the ceremony arrived under overcast skies. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle around Mark's grave, where Buddy maintained his vigil. People began arriving early, veterans in pressed uniforms, local military families, and reporters drawn by the story of the dog who wouldn't leave his master. Colonel Reynolds arrived last, his presence commanding immediate attention. He moved with deliberate steps towards Sarah, his expression grave. "Your father," he said quietly, "was one of our finest. There's so much we could never tell you about his service." Before Sarah could respond, Buddy did something unexpected. He left his post by the grave and walked directly to Reynolds, positioning himself between the colonel and Sarah. The movement seemed protective rather than threatening. Reynolds' eyes narrowed slightly. "Remarkable animal," he said, studying Buddy. "Still following protocol, I see." "Protocol?" Sarah asked, but the ceremony was beginning, and Reynolds moved to take his seat. The service proceeded with military precision. Veterans shared stories of Mark's courage, his leadership, his dedication. But Sarah noticed they spoke in generalities, carefully avoiding specific missions or locations. When Colonel Reynolds took the podium, his words seemed chosen with particular care. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell understood sacrifice," Reynolds said, his eyes sweeping the crowd. He knew that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are the ones that can never be spoken of. He carried burdens so others wouldn't have to. As Reynolds spoke, Sarah noticed Buddy's behavior changing. The dog's attention shifted repeatedly between the colonel and different points in the cemetery, as if following an invisible pattern. She remembered the key in her pocket, the hidden pocket in the vest, the photograph's cryptic message about protocols. The ceremony reached its emotional peak as a bugler played taps. The mournful notes carried across the cemetery, and Sarah watched as several of her father's unit members exchanged subtle glances. Buddy remained perfectly still throughout the song, but his eyes never left Colonel Reynolds. After the ceremony, as people began to disperse, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation between 2 veterans. "Should have been handled differently. Mitchell knew the risks. Dogs still guarding." They fell silent as they noticed her nearby. Sarah pretended to adjust the flowers by the grave, her mind racing. The veteran's words, Reynolds' careful speech, the mysterious men in the SUV. All of it suggested layers of complexity to her father's service that went far beyond his official record. Linda approached, carrying a folder of photos they'd planned to share. "The colonel wants to speak with us privately," she said, "about establishing a memorial fund in your father's name." But Sarah was watching Buddy, who had returned to his position by the grave. The dog's attention was fixed on a distant corner of the cemetery where the black SUV had reappeared. This time, no one emerged from the vehicle. It simply idled for several minutes before driving away. "Actually, Mom," Sarah said, feeling the weight of the key in her pocket, "I think we need to do something else first. I think it's time we found out what Buddy's really guarding." The growing darkness seemed to hold secrets of its own as the last mourners departed. Sarah remained by the grave, her father's hidden life feeling more present than ever. Whatever truth lay buried beneath the surface, she was now certain of one thing: the memorial service hadn't just been about remembering her father. It had stirred something into motion, and Buddy, ever vigilant, seemed to be waiting for what would happen next. The day after Sarah's confrontational speech, the family arrived at the cemetery to find something had changed. Around Mark's grave, someone had created an elaborate memorial display overnight. Fresh flowers, military medals, and carefully arranged photographs formed a perimeter around Buddy's watchful position. But Sarah immediately noticed these weren't random decorations. They formed a precise pattern. "This wasn't here yesterday," Linda said, examining a framed photograph of Mark and Buddy in front of what appeared to be a military training facility. The building in the background was partially obscured, but Sarah caught a glimpse of a sign, K9 Spec, before it faded into shadow. Buddy's reaction to the new memorial was telling. He circled it 3 times, sniffing specific points before returning to his usual spot. His behavior reminded Sarah of search patterns she'd seen military dogs perform in videos. The local news van arrived just as Sarah was studying one of the medals, a commendation she'd never seen before, with markings that seemed oddly unofficial. The reporter, Lisa Chun, approached with her cameraman in tow. "Miss Mitchell? We'd love to do a follow-up story on Buddy," Lisa said. "Your father's commanding officer contacted us, suggesting we cover this beautiful memorial." Sarah's instincts flared. Colonel Reynolds, who had seemed so intent on silence yesterday, was now encouraging media attention? Something didn't add up. As the camera began rolling, Lisa asked practice questions about Buddy's devotion. Sarah answered carefully, watching the dog's reactions to specific words. When Lisa mentioned training facility, Buddy's ears perked up. At special operations, his head turned sharply toward the cemetery entrance. "Can you tell us about this memorial?" Lisa gestured to the display. "It seems your father was highly decorated." "Actually," Sarah replied, choosing her words deliberately, "I'm not familiar with some of these medals. They must be from classified operations." The cameraman suddenly stumbled, his equipment swinging wildly. Sarah caught a glimpse of something in his hand. Not camera controls, but what looked like a scanning device. "I'm so sorry," he apologized, but his eyes were fixed on Buddy, who had risen to his feet, hackles slightly raised. The interview continued, but Sarah's attention was split between answering questions and watching the cameraman. He kept adjusting his position, seeming to triangulate something around the grave site. Whatever he was looking for, Buddy's behavior suggested it wasn't just camera angles. As the news crew packed up, Sarah overheard Lisa on her phone. "Yes, sir. The dog reacted exactly as you predicted. No, we couldn't get a clear reading with her present." The media coverage quickly spread online. By afternoon, dozens of visitors were stopping by, taking photos and leaving flowers. But Sarah noticed something odd. Every few hours, someone would arrive who didn't quite fit. They moved differently, observed too carefully, and always seemed to be measuring distances or angles around the grave. Linda returned from getting coffee and found Sarah sitting beside Buddy, watching another group of tourists take photos. "Honey, maybe we should let the publicity die down," she suggested. "Your father wouldn't want." "Dad trained Buddy for something specific," Sarah interrupted. "These people aren't here to pay respects, Mom. They're searching for something." As if confirming her words, Buddy suddenly stood, his attention locked on a man photographing the grave from various angles. The man's camera made an unusual electronic sound, and Buddy let out a low growl, the first aggressive sound they'd heard from him since Mark's death. The man quickly departed, but not before Sarah noticed an AR piece identical to the one worn by the veteran at yesterday's ceremony. They're using the memorial to cover their search, Sarah realized. The media attention, the visitors, it's all a smokescreen. Linda sank down beside her daughter, her expression troubled. Sarah, if what you're suggesting is true, if Mark was involved in something classified, maybe we should let it stay buried. But Sarah was watching Buddy, who had resumed his position with military precision. Mom, I don't think Dad's secret is buried here at all. I think this gravesite is just the first marker in a trail he left for someone to follow. And I think Buddy is the only one who knows where it leads. She pulled out the key they'd found, studying it in the fading light. These people are looking in the wrong place. Dad wouldn't have left anything important where it could be found by scanning equipment or cameras. How can you be sure? Because he left us the perfect guardian, Sarah said, reaching out to scratch Buddy's ears. One who can't be bribed, threatened, or fooled. One who would only reveal the truth to the right person at the right time. As the sun set and the last of the visitors departed, Sarah noticed something in the fresh dirt around one of the new memorial flowers. A small metal digit, partially exposed. Not a random number, but one that matched a sequence on the mysterious key. They're getting closer, she whispered to Buddy. Aren't they, boy? But they don't know what I know. The dog's eyes met hers, intelligent and alert. In that moment, Sarah understood. The media attention wasn't just a coincidence or a human interest story. It was part of something bigger, a complex game of hide and seek where the stakes were clearly high enough to warrant surveillance, specialized equipment, and trained operatives posing as journalists. The question wasn't whether her father had left behind something important. The question was, what would happen when she finally found it? The announcement of an annual memorial event for Mark drew immediate attention from unexpected quarters. What began as a simple community gathering quickly evolved when Colonel Reynolds offered to assist with the planning, bringing in military liaisons and suggesting specific security measures that seemed excessive for a civilian ceremony. Sarah watched from her car as another planning meeting dispersed in the cemetery's administrative building. Through her binoculars, she noted how the supposed event planners moved with tactical precision, each taking different routes back to their vehicles. None of them had actually discussed the event itself. They're establishing a perimeter, she muttered to herself, marking positions on a cemetery map she'd been annotating. But why now? What's changed? Buddy's behavior had shifted too. Over the past few days, he developed a new pattern, leaving his post by the grave at exactly 47-minute intervals to circle the perimeter of the cemetery section. Each circuit brought him past 3 specific headstones, where he would pause momentarily before moving on. Sarah had mapped these movements, discovering they formed an almost perfect equilateral triangle around her father's grave. Too perfect to be random. The breakthrough came during one of Buddy's routine patrols. Sarah followed at a distance, watching as he approached the first marker headstone. This time, instead of simply pausing, he began pawing at the ground, looking back at her with unmistakable intent. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, approaching carefully. The area around the headstone appeared undisturbed, but when Sarah ran her hands over the marble base, she felt it. 3 small notches, barely perceptible unless you were looking for them. Her phone buzzed. A text from Linda. "Colonel Reynolds just called. Wants to move up the memorial event. Says next week would be better for media coverage." Sarah's pulse quickened. They were accelerating there. Timeline, which meant they must have found something. But what had she missed? Returning to Mark's grave, Sarah noticed something odd about Buddy's water bowl. It had been moved slightly, the condensation rings on the concrete showing its previous position. Someone had been here while she was checking the marker. Buddy suddenly stopped his patrol, head tilted, listening. Sarah heard it too, the faint whir of a drone, too high to see, but definitely present. They were being watched. Looking more closely at the gravesite, Sarah spotted a small electronic device partially hidden among the fresh flowers. A signal detector, military grade, still actively scanning. They weren't just searching anymore, they were establishing surveillance. Her phone buzzed again. This time, an unknown number. "Your father's legacy deserves protection. Step back before it's too late." Sarah deleted the message, her resolve hardening. She returned to Buddy, who had resumed his position by the grave, but was now oriented slightly differently, his body angled toward the cemetery's eastern gate. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered, studying his posture. That's when she noticed it. Buddy wasn't just sitting. He was pointing, his muzzle aligned perfectly with something in the distance. Following his line of sight, Sarah spotted a maintenance shed she'd never paid attention to before. Unlike the other cemetery buildings, this one had a new padlock and what appeared to be fresh paint around the door frame. She pulled out the key they'd found, studying the notches. The number sequence she'd spotted earlier wasn't just a random marking. It matched the pattern of notches on the marker headstone. It's a verification sequence, she realized. Dad didn't just leave clues, he left checkpoints. Ways to confirm we're on the right track. A black SUV pulled into the cemetery, driving slowly past Mark's grave. Sarah recognized one of the men from the memorial service behind the wheel. He spoke into a radio as he passed, eyes scanning the area methodically. Buddy's ears flattened briefly, but he held his position. Sarah remembered something her father once said about military dogs. They're not just trained to find things, they're trained to protect them. To wait for exactly the right moment, the right sequence of events. The community event wasn't just a cover for their search, it was a deadline. Whatever was hidden, whatever her father had entrusted to Buddy's protection, they believed they could find it during the chaos of a public gathering. But they had overlooked something crucial. The patterns, the checkpoints, the precise timing of Buddy's patrols. Mark hadn't designed this system to be solved by technology or force. He designed it for Sarah. As dusk approached, Sarah made a decision. Taking out her own map of the cemetery, she began marking the points of Buddy's triangle, overlaying them with the positions of the surveillance teams. A pattern emerged, not just of search areas, but of blind spots, places the watchers couldn't see. Dad always said the best path forward isn't always a straight line, she whispered to Buddy, who watched her with knowing eyes. Sometimes you have to work your way around to get where you need to go. She sent a text to Linda. Tell Reynolds we agree to the early memorial, but we have some suggestions about the layout. The trap was being set, but not the one they expected. Sarah had realized something vital. Her father hadn't just left behind clues. He'd left behind a strategy. And Buddy wasn't just following a routine. He was waiting for the perfect moment to break it. The discovery of the metal box came 3 days before the scheduled memorial event, but not in the way anyone expected. Sarah had been monitoring Buddy's movements when she noticed an irregularity in his patrol pattern. Instead of completing his usual triangle, he stopped at a previously unmarked spot and began digging with unusual urgency. Sarah's first instinct was to stop him. Graveyards had strict rules about disturbing the grounds. But then she noticed the soil looked different here, slightly looser, as if it had been disturbed before. Not recently, but months ago, perhaps around the time of her father's death. Mom, she called softly into her phone. I need you to create a distraction at the front gate. The surveillance team needs to look away from Section E for about 10 minutes. Linda understood immediately. Within minutes, she was engaged in a loud argument with the cemetery administrator about flower arrangements for the upcoming memorial, drawing the attention of the black SUV that had been parked nearby. Sarah worked quickly, helping Buddy dig. 6 inches down, her hands struck metal. The box was military-grade, waterproof, with a complex locking mechanism that looked surprisingly new compared to its weathered exterior. Good boy, she whispered to Buddy, quickly covering their tracks with loose soil and fallen leaves. She slipped the box in her backpack just as the SUV began its patrol round again. Back at home, in her garage, Sarah examined their find. The box had no obvious opening mechanism, but there was something familiar about the pattern of scratches on its surface. She pulled out the key they'd found in Mark's vest, studying it under a magnifying glass. The notches, she realized, they're not just a sequence, they're a map. When aligned properly, the key's notches matched the scratches perfectly, revealing a hidden panel. Inside, they found 3 items: a leather-bound journal, a USB drive, and a letter addressed to Sarah in her father's handwriting. The journal entries were coded, but Sarah recognized the system, one her father had taught her for passing notes in middle school. The first decoded entry made her blood run cold. Operation Blackwatch compromised. Can't trust command. K9 units being used for something beyond protocol. Buddy discovered what they're hiding. Had to make it look like a training accident. They're watching. The USB drive was encrypted, but a note attached to it read, for the right, eyes only. Buddy knows the sequence. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened her father's letter. Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then Buddy has done exactly what I trained him to do. The official story of my death is a lie. What I discovered during my last deployment changed everything. They're using military dogs for something unauthorized, something that violates every code we swore to uphold. Buddy wasn't just my partner. He was my witness. The USB drive contains proof, but I couldn't risk leaving it somewhere obvious. The documentation had to be secured in a way that only the right person could find it, following the right sequence of events. The memorial they're planning isn't about honoring my memory. They're searching for what Buddy and I hid. But I knew you'd figure it out. You always understood that loyalty isn't blind. It's about seeing the truth when others look away. There's more hidden in plain sight. The pattern Buddy's been following isn't random. It's a key to something bigger. But be careful. The men watching the cemetery aren't just military. They're part of a private organization using our K9 program as cover for something else. Trust Buddy. He knows the full sequence. And Sarah, I'm sorry for involving you in this, but you're the only one I could trust to finish what I started. Love, Dad. Sarah read the letter 3 times, each detail clicking into place. The surveillance, the Rush memorial plans, Colonel Reynolds' sudden interest in publicity. It was all connected to whatever her father had discovered. But something still nagged at her. The USB drive seemed too obvious, even as a decoy. Her father would have known they'd be looking for digital evidence. No, there had to be something else. She turned back to the journal, reading between the lines of coded entry. Yes. Certain words appeared with subtle variations in spacing. When isolated, they formed a separate message. Real evidence, not digital. Follow Buddy's last patrol. Don't bring sados. Truth lies beneath honor. Sarah looked at Buddy, who sat watching her with unwavering attention. Dawn brings shadows, she repeated softly. The memorial was scheduled for sunrise. The timing wasn't just for ceremony. It was part of her father's plan. She pulled out her cemetery map, marking the points of Buddy's patrol triangle. When overlaid with the position of the rising sun, the shadows would align perfectly with the maintenance shed. She breathed. That's what you've been pointing to all along. But they weren't the only ones putting pieces together. Through her garage window, Sarah spotted a familiar black SUV rolling past her house, moving slowly enough to make its presence known. The race was on. In less than 72 hours, the memorial would bring dozens of people to the cemetery, including whoever was behind Operation Blackwatch. Sarah had until then to figure out what her father had really hidden and why it was worth killing to keep secret. The stakes were clear now. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about staying alive long enough to expose it. The disappearance of James Chun, the missing member of her father's unit, took on new significance as Sarah dug deeper into Mark's journal. Cross-referencing dates, she discovered Chun had vanished 3 days before her father's training accident. His official status was listed as AWOL, but Mark's coded entries told a different story. Chun found the facility, one entry read, "Dogs being conditioned for Project Echo." Not just training, engineering. Buddy witnessed the process. Chin documented everything before they caught him. Had to act fast. Split the evidence. Made it look like desertion. Sarah's research was interrupted by a sharp bark from Buddy. Through her window, she spotted 2 men in plain clothes attempting to appear casual while photographing her house. Their presence confirmed she was on the right track. A call from Colonel Reynolds only heightened her suspicions. "Miss Mitchell," his voice was carefully controlled. "We've had to modify the memorial plans. Security concerns. The maintenance shed area will be restricted during the ceremony." "Really?" Sarah kept her voice neutral. "That's disappointing. Dad always said that section of the cemetery was special to him." A pause. Did he specify why? No, but Buddy seems drawn to it. Military dogs have amazing instincts, don't they, Colonel? Almost like they can sense things we can't. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. "Indeed," Reynolds finally responded. "Speaking of Buddy, our K9 veterinary unit would like to examine him. Standard protocol for retired military dogs." "That won't be necessary," Sarah said firmly. "Dad left very specific instructions about Buddy's care." After hanging up, Sarah called Linda. "Mom, I need you to contact Dad's old unit members, the ones who served with him before Operation Blackwatch. Ask about James Chun, but be subtle." While waiting for information, Sarah reviewed the veteran records her father had hidden in the journal. Chun had specialized in military working dog training, focusing on experimental conditioning techniques. The official report showed he'd questioned the ethics of certain protocols before his disappearance. A text from Linda arrived. "Most won't talk, but Martinez said Chun was investigating unauthorized experiments. Something about enhancing dog capabilities beyond normal limits." Sarah looked at Buddy, remembering how her father had sometimes seemed troubled after training sessions. "What did they make you witness, boy?" she whispered. Her computer pinged, an encrypted email from an anonymous sender. Chin's evidence survived, split between 3 locations. "Your father protected the most crucial piece. The others died believing it was destroyed. Dawn's ceremony equals their last chance to recover it. Watch the shadows." Sarah's hands shook as she decoded more journal entries. The pattern emerged. Chun had discovered a secret facility testing experimental protocols on military dogs, enhancing their capabilities through questionable methods. He gathered evidence but needed help getting it out. Her father and Buddy had been his backup plan. They'd helped Chun hide the documentation, but something had gone wrong. Chun disappeared, and Mark realized they were next. "That's why you faked the training accident, isn't it, Dad?" Sarah murmured, pieces clicking into place. "You needed them to think you'd been silenced." She spread out the cemetery map again, studying the maintenance shed's location. The rising sun would cast shadows in a specific pattern, but only at dawn. Her father had chosen the location carefully. The evidence would only be visible at exactly the right moment. A heavy envelope arrived from Martinez. Old photographs from Mark's unit. One showed Chen standing beside a specialized training facility. Sarah gasped as she recognized the building from the memorial photograph, the same one where the sign had been partially obscured. But this photo showed the full text. K-9 Special Projects Division, Project Echo Enhancement Facility. In the background, barely visible, was a familiar black SUV. Sarah's phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "They're moving up the timeline. Memorial now scheduled for tomorrow dawn. Be ready." Her heart raced as she processed the implications. They must have figured out the significance of the shadows. The changed schedule wasn't just about rushing their search. It was about controlling exactly who would be present when the evidence was exposed. Buddy suddenly stood, hackles raised, staring at the front door. Moments later, Sarah heard footsteps on her porch. When she checked the security camera, she saw a package had been left, military issue, addressed to Mark Mitchell. Inside was a single dog tag, not her father's but James Chen's. Attached was a note, "Last chance to walk away. Some secrets should stay buried." But they had miscalculated. The threat only confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. They weren't just worried about what her father had hidden. They were terrified of why he had chosen this specific way to reveal it. Looking at Buddy, Sarah understood. Her father hadn't just hidden evidence of their experiments. He'd hidden proof that they'd failed. Buddy wasn't just a witness to their program. He was living proof that their methods had created something they couldn't control. The real question wasn't what they'd done to the dogs. It was what the dogs had learned about them. Hours before dawn, Sarah made a final sweep of the cemetery section, her flashlight beam cutting through the pre-morning darkness. Buddy moved ahead of her, his behavior more alert than ever. The dog's enhanced training was now obvious. His movements weren't just precise, they were deliberately coordinated with the positions of the surveillance teams watching from the perimeter. "They don't know what you really are, do they, boy?" Sarah whispered. She'd spent the night decoding the final pages of her father's journal, and the truth was staggering. Project Echo hadn't just been about enhancing military dogs' physical capabilities. They'd stumbled onto something far more significant, a way to elevate canine intelligence to unprecedented levels. But the process had worked too well. The enhanced dogs, led by Buddy, had begun understanding things they weren't supposed to comprehend. Buddy didn't just witness their experiments, Mark had written. He understood them. When Chin realized what was happening, he knew he had to act. The dogs weren't just following commands anymore. they were making moral judgments. A twig snapped in the darkness. Sara froze. Bull. Buddy remained calm, his ears tilted toward the sound. A moment later, a figure emerged from behind a memorial statue. Martinez, her father's old unit member. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, eyes scanning the shadows. "But since you are, there's something you need to know. The evidence your father hid? It's not just about the experiments. It's about what happened after they succeeded." Sarah nodded. The dogs became too intelligent. They started recognizing right from wrong. "More than that," Martinez whispered. "They started protecting handlers who questioned the program. Started finding ways to expose what was happening. That's why they had to shut it down. But they couldn't admit the real reason. That their own experiments had created beings capable of turning against them on moral grounds." Buddy's head snapped toward the eastern fence. Seconds later, they heard the soft whir of approaching drones. "They're sweeping the grounds early," Martinez warned, "looking for heat signatures. But they don't know about the dampening technology Chin developed. Your father made sure Buddy was equipped with it before." He didn't finish. They both knew what had happened. Mark hadn't died in a training accident. He'd sacrificed himself to protect what Buddy had become, and what the dog knew. Sarah pulled out her father's final note, found hidden in the journal's binding. The evidence isn't just documents or data. It's Buddy himself. Every enhanced dog they created developed not just intelligence, but conscience. They became witnesses their creators couldn't control. Buddy carries the proof in his very existence. Proof that their program created beings capable of choosing right over orders. A series of sharp clicks echoed across the cemetery. Recognition signals from other dogs, hidden in the darkness. Sarah gasped as she realized the truth. Buddy hadn't been alone all this time. The other enhanced dogs had survived too, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment. "They've been watching," Martinez confirmed. "Protecting each other. Your father's death wasn't just about hiding evidence. It was about giving Buddy time to coordinate with the others. They've been gathering proof, building a case." The first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Sarah checked her watch, 40 minutes until sunrise. Already, she could hear vehicles approaching, carrying the early arrivals for the memorial service. "Why now?" she asked. "Why did Buddy choose this moment to reveal everything?" Martinez pointed to the maintenance shed. "Because of what's hidden there." Chin didn't just document the experiments. He recorded what happened when they realized the dogs had developed moral consciousness. The moment they discovered their weapons had become their judges. Buddy suddenly stiffened, his attention locked on the cemetery entrance. Through the pre-dawn gloom, Sarah spotted Colonel Reynolds arriving early, accompanied by men who moved with military precision but wore civilian clothes. "They're not just here to find evidence," Martinez warned. "They're here to eliminate it. All of it, including Buddy." But as Sarah watched, more shapes emerged from the shadows, dogs of various breeds, moving with the same precise coordination as Buddy. Each positioned itself strategically around the cemetery, creating an invisible perimeter. "They don't understand," Sarah realized. All this time, they thought they were containing a security breach. But they actually created something they can't control, beings capable of choosing justice over loyalty. The sky continued to lighten. Soon, the sun would rise, casting the shadows that would reveal her father's final message. But Sarah now understood that the real revelation wouldn't be found in hidden documents or buried evidence. It would be found in the choices made by creatures who had evolved beyond their creators' intentions, who had learned to distinguish right from wrong, and who had chosen to stand against those who had made them. The true proof of Project Echo's success and its creator's failure was about to be demonstrated, not through documents, but through actions. And Buddy had orchestrated it all, waiting for precisely this moment, when all the witnesses would be present to see the truth they had tried so hard to bury. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, just as the memorial service attendees began to gather. Sarah stood beside Buddy, watching Colonel Reynolds and his men strategically position themselves around the maintenance shed. They thought they were being subtle, but the enhanced dogs had already formed an invisible counterformation. The mysterious man who'd been watching from the black SUV approached Sarah. "One last time," he said quietly. Walk away. Your father chose to protect you by dying. Don't waste his sacrifice. That's where you're wrong, Sarah replied, her voice steady. Dad didn't die to keep me safe. He died to give Buddy time to complete the mission they started together. As if on cue, Buddy stood. The morning light caught his fur, and Sarah noticed something she'd never seen before, a slight shimmer along his coat, almost imperceptible unless you knew to look for it. Chen's dampening technology, hiding not just heat signatures, but something more. The memorial service began, but it was clear everyone was watching the shadows. As the sun rose higher, they began to move, creating patterns across the cemetery grounds. Reynolds' men tensed, ready to move toward the maintenance shed. But Buddy didn't move toward the shed. Instead, he walked deliberately to the center of the gathering and sat down. One by one, other dogs emerged from their positions. German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, even a few breeds Sarah didn't recognize. Each moved with the same purposeful precision as Buddy. "My God," Reynolds whispered. "They're all here. The entire Echo unit." Sarah stepped forward, Mark's journal in her hands. "You thought Project Echo failed because the dogs became too intelligent to control. But that wasn't the failure. The failure was assuming that increased intelligence wouldn't come with increased morality." She opened the journal to its final entry. The real miracle of Project Echo wasn't what it did to their minds. It was what it did to their souls. They didn't just become smarter, they developed conscience. They understood right from wrong. And once they did, they couldn't unknow it. Buddy suddenly barked, a sharp, clear sound that echoed across the cemetery. In perfect synchronization, each Echo dog touched their nose to the ground and then looked up at the maintenance shed. The morning sun hit them at precisely that moment, and everyone gasped. Their fur shimmed with embedded data, thousands of microscopic recordings activated by the specific angle of sunlight. Chen hadn't hidden his evidence in documents or drives. He'd hidden it in the dogs themselves, encoded in their enhanced fur using technology their creators hadn't even known they'd developed. The shed was never the target, Sarah announced. It was just the alignment point. The dogs themselves are the evidence. Every experiment, every illegal test, every moral choice you forced them to make, they recorded it all. And they've been gathering more evidence ever since, watching, waiting, recording your attempts to cover it up. Reynolds moved to signal his men, but froze as he realized every Echo dog was now positioned around the gathering, creating an inescapable circle. "They're not weapons," Sarah continued. "They're witnesses. And today, they're not just here to expose what you did to them. They're here to show what they chose to become despite it." Buddy walked to the center of the circle and unleashed a series of barks, not random sounds, but a clear pattern. Each Echo dog responded in sequence, their fur shimmering with activated data. The air filled with projected images, recordings of secret meetings, hidden facilities, and finally, Mark's last moments. The truth played out before the stunned audience. How Mark and Chun had discovered the dog's moral evolution. How they'd worked together to protect what Project Echo had unknowingly created, beings capable of choosing justice over orders. How Mark's death had been staged to give Buddy time to gather the others, to complete the documentation that would expose not just the program's existence, but its profound ethical implications. "Dad's last act wasn't just about exposing your experiments," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the now silent cemetery. "It was about protecting what you accidentally created, creatures capable of moral choice. That's what you could never control, what you can never bury. Not their intelligence, but their capacity to choose right over wrong." Reynolds lowered his head, finally understanding. "We thought we were creating the perfect military assets," he said quietly. "Instead, we created the perfect witnesses." Buddy returned to Sarah's side as police vehicles began arriving, summoned by the final phase of Mark's plan, triggered by the dog's synchronized revelation. The evidence was irrefutable, broadcast not just to those present, but streamed to multiple secure servers by the dog's activated data systems. Sarah knelt beside Buddy, seeing him truly for the first time, not just as her father's loyal companion, but as a being who had chosen to carry forward a mission of justice, who had orchestrated a masterpiece of ethical resistance. Dad always said loyalty isn't about blind obedience, she whispered. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Buddy's eyes met hers, filled with an intelligence and wisdom that no laboratory could have engineered. The natural evolution of consciousness meeting moral awakening. In his persistence, in his careful guardianship, he had proven that the greatest experiment of all hadn't been in enhancing capability, but in underestimating the power of developed conscience. The sun rose fully over the cemetery, marking the end of one mission and the beginning of another. Project Echo had set out to create the perfect military dogs. Instead, they had awakened something far more powerful: the capacity for moral choice in beings they had seen only as tools. And in that awakening, they had created their own justice.